Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Thank you.
How are you? It's very tepid. In Africa, and Lulama tried to do that, we respond. Good morning.
Good morning.
Much better. How are you?
Good, thank you.
I often tease my audiences, depending on the racial composition, in saying the warmth of the response depends on the melanin level. Good morning again. So, I'm really honored and delighted to be here. And I thank the people who've come before. Lulama, thank you very much for recognizing our history and our land. Thank you, June. Thank you very much, Dr. Ned. And thank you very much to Tami and Kadimeng as well. I want to tell you a story. And the story is about my life, but it's also about our lives in South Africa. When I was coming here this morning along William Nicol, which is one of the major south-northwest arteries in Johannesburg, I passed the site where we met. I think it was 2 years ago or a year ago, June, and where we started planning for this forum, this conference, this convening. And it's the Witkoppen Clinic. It's the oldest pro bono, oldest non-profit clinic outside Cape Town, in the northern part of Johannesburg. And I recognized where it was, although I've been there many times, from the massive crowd already queuing at 7:15 this morning. So your investment in Witkoppen, your investment in the children in that queue, is something that indicates that my first story from my life is about poverty. I grew up in a fractured home with parents who couldn't care for us. My father had a catastrophic dependency on alcohol, and I ended up with my siblings in a children's home where I spent nearly 5 years from the age of 6. Now, why do I tell you about poverty? I only tell you because we in South Africa, we unnecessarily still have children who go hungry. We have school children who are entitled to school meals but don't always get them because of governmental dysfunction, because of other problems, systemic problems like corruption, funding taken away. But my own experience of poverty and very occasional hunger made me humbly realize what more people than I knew when I was young experience. But then I experienced privilege. When I was 14 in the second year of high school, I got into a wonderful school, not far from here, about 40 kilometers, called Pretoria Boys High. I had to be there for a ceremony on Friday. Hadn't been there for 3 or 4 years. It's a magnificent school, built on a koppie, as we call it, a little knoll, a hill, facing the Union buildings, beautiful buildings, 1,500 kids. Now, as Tami, Nom Tamsanga was telling us. No, I didn't get the cue right. You and the Lama will teach me. As Tami was saying, now integrated, diverse, inclusive. But when I got there, whites only. From Pretoria Boys High, I went to a magnificent university that I'm involved with now in a ceremonial position as Chancellor. Stellenbosch University, whites only. At the end of my Stellenbosch studies, I was elected to a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford. At the time I was elected, only whites from South Africa had ever been elected to a Rhodes Scholar, to a Rhodes Scholarship. The first black African Rhodes Scholar from South Africa was Loisa Nonga. Loisa Nonga, Tami. And he was elected 2 years after me. We became friends at Oxford. As a young 23-year-old white South African, the first black person that I grew to know intimately, who became an intense and close friend, was at Oxford. Loisa, our careers have matched. He was a mathematician. He did a brilliant DPhil at Oxford. He became the first black vice-chancellor of the university here, Wits University, when I was chair of its governing council. So my life has been defined by poverty and by racial privilege. My path out of poverty was defined by my whiteness. And that has given me a profound sense of what governmental intervention can do. White privilege didn't happen by accident. It was constructed by racial ideology. And that privileged me. And it's important to note that that privilege still resides in me. It still guides my life. You don't walk away from racial privilege at the end of apartheid. Sometimes when I talk to black youngsters at secondary or tertiary level, I say, when I walked in and you saw an older white man, I didn't say an old white man, by the way. You see an older white man. Are you investing me with an authority that you wouldn't give Dr. Ned? Not that you're old, sir. But part of that, I'll come back to that now when I talk about the two further influences on my life. At Pretoria Boys High, wonderful school, exciting environment, academically challenging, opportunities that opened up my life. I discovered, to my absolute horror, at the onset of puberty, my complete aghastness, that I was gay. I felt an enormous shame. The third feature of my life has been the defining feature of shame about sexual orientation. I tried to hide it. I fought against it. I made relationships with girls and then with women. I got married to a woman. And then at the age of 30, I realized that I should cast off my shame, that I should assert what is a constitutive part of myself. No choice, not a lifestyle, a deep part of humanity wherever it is. Throughout the world, 7 to 10% of people have some element of same-sex orientation or transness in them. And the world has still got a long way to go. Some of you come from countries where people are still persecuted. You mentioned Ukraine, Tammy. You mentioned Uganda when you had the U word. Uganda, 2 weeks ago, adopted what is probably the most hate-filled, vicious, and appalling anti-queer statute ever enacted by any humans. The biblical prohibitions, allegedly, challenged by Quranic, Talmudic, and Christian scholars, the seeming prohibitions in the Bible and Quran and the Talmud are nothing compared to what is contained in the Uganda statute. So, still, on our continent, this beautiful continent, we have much work to do. In the 1980s, when I was an anti-apartheid lawyer, I fought against apartheid, but I also included the fight for gay and lesbian equality. That culminated in the constitution that Lulama mentioned, that President Mbeki inaugurated, when we achieved a world first. The first and only constitution in the world that contained in its equality cause those two words, sexual orientation. And at the end of the year in which the constitution was enacted, President Mandela appointed me a judge of the High Court. And never, when I met him for the first time at that point, never in all of my interviews for the Supreme Court of Appeal, the Labour Appeal Court, the Constitutional Court, did anyone ever say, but you, an openly and proudly gay man, how can you serve in our country's highest court? That's how it should be, that we embrace and rejoice in each other's diversity, that we don't discriminate because a woman wears a hijab, or someone speaks Venda, or someone is a trans man or a trans woman, where we are inclusive. We empower ourselves, we empower our countries through inclusiveness. But after coming out, after experiencing poverty, after experiencing the unsought and undue benefits, but humbling benefits, teaching benefits of racial privilege, after experiencing the shame and fighting the shame of sexual orientation, I encountered perhaps the biggest challenge of my life, which was stigma. Not long after I came out as a gay man, I became infected with HIV. And I was diagnosed a year or two later, at the very time when HIV epidemic in North America had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. President Ronald Reagan had not mentioned AIDS yet until 1987, after I was diagnosed. It was a terrible time, and it was certain death. I knew I would never turn 40. I was 33 years old. I would never be 40. I would never see a racially just or democratic or constitutional South Africa. I would never achieve my back brain ambition of becoming a judge in a democratic and non-racial South Africa, because I was going to die. But worse than the knowledge of a catastrophically foreshortened life was the stigma. The stigma was from outside. It was because at that point, most people diagnosed with HIV and dying of AIDS were people like myself, young gay men in their 30s and 40s, often professionalized, often people who had talents in the artistic or other spheres. And the stigma was intense. And it didn't change when we realized at about that time that in Africa, the epidemic took a very different course. It wasn't almost entirely confined to homosexual men and men having sex with men. It was an epidemic of sexually transmitted disease amongst heterosexual black Africans. And the stigma intensified because they were poor. Black Africans were not entitled to treatment because they were poor. And the stigma was magnified enormously by a terrible mistake that the successor of President Nelson Mandela made, which was President Thabo Mbeki, whom Lulama quoted twice. He thought it was about blackness. He said, the white people, the white knowledge system, the white power has colonized us, has extracted our resources, has enslaved us, has transported us, has subordinated us, subjected us, humiliated us. Now you tell us that we are having sex like gay men. What he didn't see is that the epidemic was limited to Central and Southern Africa, the Bantu-speaking peoples of Central and Southern Africa. There's no mass epidemic in West Africa. So all his suppositions that this is because the epidemiologists and doctors are telling us that black people in Africa have sex differently, he was wrong. There's some other cause. Dr. Ned, I believe it's genetic. I believe there's a genetic predisposition in Central and Southern Africa to rapid transmission of HIV. The stigma was enormous, and much of it is internalized. There's no opportunity now to talk about internal stigma, but stigma, I fought that internal stigma. Only after I'd fallen ill with AIDS, when I was on the bench in the High Court, 1997, I fell very severely ill. I was certain to die. My life expectancy was 30 to 36 months, but a miracle occurred, a personal miracle. I was able, with my judge's salary, to purchase life. I got onto antiretrovirals 25 years ago, 25 years and 8 months ago. And my life was given back to me. It was the most moving moment. It is what has brought me here today. It's what brought me to my involvement with an association with Witkoppen Clinic. The sense of joy, the sense of disbelief. And I joined the treatment action campaign, started by a young South African from the township, Zaki Ahmed, who fought the drug companies and succeeded, brought down the drug prices, made them available to all Africans who need antiretroviral treatment, then had to fight President Mbeki through the courts. The Constitutional Court, before I joined it, gave a momentous order against President Mbeki, saying to him, you have to start making ARV treatment available to people who need it in South Africa. An enormous triumph for the rule of law. So, let me wrap up with a few lessons that those 4 features of my life, poverty, white racial privilege, shame and stigma, have taught me. And the first lesson is difficult, but a simple one. Work with what you have. You might be in a difficult marriage. You might have a child with learning difficulties. You might have a job that doesn't suit you. I didn't want to have HIV. I didn't want to be gay. And they became empowering features of my life. A second lesson I've learned is that you may be surprised. Someone said earlier that you can't predict the future in South Africa. In a positive sense, I knew I was going to die. I was certain to die of AIDS, the terrible death that AIDS inflicts. And then antiretroviral treatment came. I never thought for those first 10 or 12 years of living with HIV that I would be an older man, which I'm very joyful to be. And a third lesson, a very important lesson, is about trust. I've never ever said to anyone, come out as queer, as gay, as same-sex oriented, as trans, to your family, to your colleagues, to your best friends, to your neighbors, to your congregation. But I've said to them, see where you can locate trust. And if you can locate trust, consider coming out. I do the same with HIV. I've never ever said, when I came out with my HIV after recovering from AIDS, I expected people to join. We've got 13% of our population in South Africa. When you go to Witkoppen Clinic, as I hope you will, you'll see that many of the people there, up to 40% of the people there, are living with HIV or AIDS. But no one speaks about it. It's the external stigma, plus it's the internalized stigma. No leaders have spoken out in Africa. President Mandela spoke about his son Makgato. President Kaunda, the president of Mozambique, Joachim Chissano, spoke about their children. But no one has said, I'm living with HIV. And my lesson is that the astonishing amount of trust that you get. When I spoke out, I was terrified of public vilification. I spoke out in Cape Town. I flew back to Johannesburg to be in court the next day. My room was filled with flowers. Colleagues popped in. People still stop me in the malls and on the street because you can trust. I'm not saying that there hasn't been violence. There's still violence, especially for lesbian women in townships. But I'm with Tutu. I'm with Mandela. There's greater love than hate. And you repose your trust in the right people, your life is enormously, vastly, inexpressibly enriched. And the last lesson, which is one for your leadership, there's nothing in our world that cannot be fixed by human effort. We can start with stigma and prejudice and shame. They exist only here. The good thing about race stigma, about AIDS phobia, about homophobia, is that they are conditions of mind that can be addressed immediately. But beyond that, our country is in a grave crisis. Your country, June, Dr. Khan, Ned, a grave crisis. The terrible prospect of hideous malformation of leadership taking over again, which terrifies me. Europe is in crisis with a monstrous war that my government has yet to condemn unequivocally and shamefully. But we can fix it. We can fix our electricity supply, our roads. We need leadership. That's why the Inglovo choir this morning was to me so inspiring. I see the youngsters, and I can never, ever be complacent. I can never, ever say that we, my generation, we've had our chance. The new generation deserves that chance. They deserve the opportunity to fix what is wrong in our country, and they can do it with your help, with your guidance, with your energy, with your vision, with your leadership. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to continue this wonderful conversation we're having around leadership. And I am honored to have this conversation with you, Justice Cameron. And as I start and I reflect on your story, and I also reflect on something I read where someone acknowledged you as the greatest legal mind of your generation. And I couple that with the great story you just shared of your courageous journey. I want to start this leadership conversation talking a little bit about courage. Where did you get your courage? And as you were dealing with the stigma that you spoke of, what inside of you gave you that courage to stand in your identity?
What a beautiful question. Thank you, June. As you were talking, I was thinking that the first thing that required courage for me was to take a stand on race. And that was impelled partly by a sense of my own shame, how I benefited, the racial things that I did. I remembered a story where I feel ashamed to tell it here, but the first domestic employee we had when I was at high school, we didn't have domestic employees when we were in poverty, but most white households, and now most middle class households, black or white, have them. We had a separate enamel plate and mug for her. And I feel such mortification about that. Mm-hmm. But the second issue was necessity. So courage with my queerness, with my HIV, I kept that undercover for nearly 12 years. So footnotes to the courage you attribute to me. Yeah. And then I spoke out after I was better. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, and it's interesting that when I think about my own courage, it was also about finding my voice and being able to use that voice in places where it may not have even been the dominant point of view. And again, it's believing internally that your voice should be heard, even though it isn't the mainstream perspective. And
wasn't the choir director beautiful when he spoke about Sandile growing up at his hip? And look at Sandile now, a world-acclaimed musician. And did you feel like Sandile, and then you've grown into a world figure at Kellogg and in all your projects?
Absolutely, and I have to say, I still feel like Sandile. It is a journey that we all must take, and we all continue to take. But yes, there is and particularly for me, growing up as the 9th of 10 children, there was always reverence for others and those who came before me, which in some ways is silencing. And so learning to find a space there was a journey that I had to take.
And what made the difference for you? That from reverence for others, which is such a beautiful word, to assertion of self. What was it that made that difference?
It was self-confidence and self-esteem. And it sounds like that was similar for you as well. Knowing that you are who you are and you're powerful in that space.
And I would add the wonderful sense of agency that we have in this world. What you are doing at the foundation, what Dr. Ned is doing, what the trustees and the staff are doing. I get up in the morning and South Africa is in such a dire place. And yet, we can change it. Each of us can. We really have agency. Perhaps we don't have the power that our president at the moment has and is not utilizing. I didn't say that. But we each in our own way every day.
I agree with that fully. And speaking of that, when we think about your role in the LGBTQ movement in South Africa, speak about agency in that space and how you showed up to lead that movement.
It really was necessity. I had a marriage to a woman who's still very close to me. I'm close to her and to her son from a subsequent marriage. And I realized that I had to integrate my true self. And that impelled me to speak out at a time when it was still dangerous and unusual. And then the trust issue, the fact that you find other people. In the movement for racial justice in South Africa and in the United States and elsewhere, it's the unison and the empowerment through other people that made the difference for me with queer advancement, queer equality in South Africa.
Yes.
And of course, that's what President Museveni is so scared of. He and President Erdogan both say that LGBTIQ people are infiltrating. They're already there.
Exactly.
But they fear the power. Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes. So let's go a little bit deeper into that word stigma. You wrote, stigma, stigma, stigma. That is at the core of whether we embrace one's humanity or not. Talk a little bit more about your coaching to all of us around stigma.
It's a brand on your forehead. You are black.
Yeah.
You're a woman. You're queer. You have HIV. And the difficulty that I referred to twice when I spoke just now was that we take it into ourselves. As a queer man, as someone living with HIV, I've deeply experienced internalized stigma and I fight against it. That little whisper, is it really normal to be queer?
Yeah.
The little whisper, am I not contaminated by... No, I'm not contaminated by my
Exactly.
HIV. No, it is normal.
Right.
Queerness is normal.
Yes.
So we fight it. And then when I speak to black audiences, I quote Steve Biko. Steve Biko said, black man, you're on your own. You must lose your sense of inferiority. He said that. So I can't say it as a white man because of reverence about my racial privilege and humility, but Steve Biko does. And friends of mine, a friend called Nini Mulifi, talks about what she calls internalized oppression, your internal oppressor. So it's with race, it's with queerness, it's with stigma, it's with women. So, yeah.
Very much, and I'm a double stigma. I'm a woman and a black woman.
And may I say this without the entitlement to do so, I think I'm with Ta-Nehisi Coates. The legacy of enslaving people is still imprisoning white people in America.
Yes.
So if you are descendants of enslaved people, there's the prison that white people are still in.
Yes.
In North America.
And that's why we talk a lot about healing.
Yeah.
And we believe everyone must heal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Everyone.
It isn't about just those who have been oppressed. We all have pain from that journey.
The Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, apartheid injured black people, but it also injured white people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. And, we all must address that. When I think about the role that I have now as president and CEO of the WK Kellogg Foundation, there was a time when I thought that's not for me. I watched those who had that position before me. They were all white males. I used to say in my mind, they all are even starting to look like Mr. Kellogg, who was a white bald man with glasses. And I thought, this isn't a role for me. And I had to overcome that stigma and work to convince myself first that I was worthy, and then to pursue it. And again,
wonderful story.
yes. So I want to talk a little bit about the Black economic empowerment legislation, and I know you were a part of it. We talk about it as equity, and I think in the United States now, equity is being used more frequently. People understand that there are these disadvantages that are structurally in place, and we're starting to talk about how we might dismantle some of those structures. But in 1994, as apartheid ended, South African government actually wrote into the Constitution the Black Economic Empowerment Act. Can you tell us a little bit about what that act provides today?
You're right about our Constitution. It's a very important provision in the Equality Clause that says measures to lessen disadvantage, to empower people systemically disadvantaged in the past are not unfair discrimination. From that has flowed the legislation you mentioned. And I want to say two things, Lejeune, and they're both quite controversial, so I haven't said them. The one is that I think that quotas are not a good idea. And I've worked with that as chair for 10.5 years of the governing council of the university I mentioned. We were going through that. And I think targets are right. We gave a decision. Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, when he was Deputy Chief Justice, gave an important decision in the prison service, where I'm now involved as inspecting judge of prisons. And he said, no, you can't have quotas. They were trying to apply quotas in the Western Cape, which has got a nearly 50% people of what we call colored people, with scare quotes, mixed race people. And the Department of Prisons said, well, we've got a national quota of 10%, which we're going to apply in the Western Cape as well to colored people. And he struck that down. The second thing I want to say is that I think that our empowerment legislation has created, it selected elites, and it could have done better. There were practical ways through shareholding distributions which would have empowered the people who are waiting outside Witkoppen Clinic. And in those two respects, having said that, I think our Constitution got it right.
Yeah, and I think about that a lot recently, because any day now we will hear from our Supreme Court as to whether affirmative action will remain constitutional.
In a challenge brought by people of Asian descent at Harvard.
Exactly.
So it's complicated everything.
Yes. And, I see that as taking us back decades, back to the 60s and the Civil Rights Act. But I also think fundamentally that the construct is misunderstood. To your point, some people believe that it is about quotas. Some people, believe that it is creating a reverse discrimination, which is a term that was created. When you think about the Black Economic Empowerment Act and affirmative action as we see it in the United States, do you see places where we need to continue on that role and where it works, and then talk about maybe where it doesn't work?
I think we need to expand it. I think we have got an elite in South Africa which is now largely, but not entirely, non-racialized. But what about the kids from the township? What about the rural kids? In South Africa, the youngsters who go to formerly white schools in the suburbs or to elite white schools, formerly white schools, talk with a different accent. So from people who grew up in the townships, I think that rural origin and township origin is important, so we should expand it. And may I say this, there is no doubt that our form of affirmative action has transformed many institutions. Many people, many institutions need a kick in the butt.
Yeah.
And
we agree.
Affirmative action, there. High five.
For sure. And, I think as we think about what may happen in the United States, it is how do you continue to do this work and continue to expand those opportunities, because at the end of the day, that's what's needed.
All credit to Chief Justice John Roberts in the United States for his surprising vote in the Alabama case.
Yes.
Friends, ladies and gentlemen, there was a surprising vote that upheld a strike down of an exclusionary districting that excluded black people. But he said something which, I'm not going to use the S word, but it's not one of the most unwise things that I think a judge. He said the only way to get rid of racial discrimination is to stop using race. That's not true. You've got to be racially conscious. You've got to be class conscious. You've got to be gender conscious.
Thank you. Yes. Amen. I mean, we know that denial is not something that actually corrects.
And that's the point I make when I talk to white audiences. I say, it feels unfair to you almost 30 years after democracy, but I became a judge. I helped my niece with her first house. So the racial privilege I collected as a white person endures, and it endures generationally. So it's not the end. You've got to be subtle, you've got to be careful, but you've got to continue using it.
Thank you so much. These lessons are the lessons we want to share all week, and you're starting us off in a very great space.
I hope to heaven that I'm saying things which I don't need to say to you, and I say them in humility, June, and thank you for the opportunity to share them with you.
Absolutely. So one last question as we close. This afternoon, we are all headed to Constitution Hill and the Apartheid Museum. So from your perspective, someone who's lived this history, share with us what we may learn or take away from the visit this afternoon.
Wow. The first thing is that it's the site of a prison. Number 5, which is still open, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of black men were imprisoned simply because they didn't have a pass, a humiliating, white-imposed card that said you can be in the urban areas. This is the country of our birth. They were treated as strangers. The site was chosen because it had terrible memories from apartheid. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned in the fort, Mahatma Gandhi, and then working-class black men from the streets of Johannesburg. I often refer to the past laws and I say, what are we doing today to cross-border migrants? Are we not treating them in the same way? We're throwing them into the back of police vans and imprisoning them.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I loved it when Lulama said, he quoted from the Freedom Charter that says South Africa belongs to all who live in it, including cross-border migrants.
Yes, yes.
So, but the second thing that I would say is that the Constitutional Court itself is a beautiful court. It's a functioning court. It's a court with people of incredible courage in it. The courage it took to strike down President Mbeki's AIDS policy was enormous. The courage it took that court 2 years ago to send a man who is evading criminal charges, a former president, I'm not talking about President Trump, I'm talking about President Zuma, to send him to prison. So it's a court staffed by people of courage and vision, and its architecture represents all of that. So you're in for a wonderful treat.
Well, I feel honored to have the opportunity to take such a visit, and I am so honored to have spoken with you this morning. This has been a wonderful conversation of great, courageous leadership, and we thank you so much, Justice Cameron. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.